Southeast Mortgage, the official home loan lender of the Georgia Bulldogs, presents the official podcast of Dawgs on Demand on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. On today's program, we'll give you the latest news from the world of University of Georgia athletics and more. And now, from the broadcast studios of Dawgs on Demand, here's your host, Chris Hall.
Chris Hall here for Dawgs on Demand on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. It's good to have you with us today on our program. And today we have with us Jason Hasty. Jason works with the University of Georgia. He's the athletics historian and archivist at the University of Georgia. And Jason, now, first of all, did I get your title correct? Or do I need to add something? We want to make sure we get you right. Is that correct?
That is correct. You know, the university has an official title for me, but don't worry about that. The athletics historian and archivist is what I do and what people know me as. That's right. Feel free to add any titles. I'm always glad to pick up another title every once in a while. So if you can come up with a good one, let me know, and I might add it on my business card.
Very good. So, of course, you work for the University of Georgia, and you keep up with all the cool stuff, all the history stuff having to do with Georgia athletics. I thought we'd start our program today by showing you a card that we have. It comes from one of the yearbooks here. I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but this is a picture of the first University of Georgia football team. Now we're celebrating an anniversary of that, and this is the story of the very first football team ever fielded by the University of Georgia. And I know you're very familiar with that. Tell us the story behind that.
So it was January 30th, 1892 is really the birthday of Georgia football. It was on that day on what's now called Hargrett Field, which is a lovely park and a fountain with a fountain on it now on campus. I'm sure most people, if they've been through campus, have walked across Hargrett Field. Certainly going down to Sanford from downtown, they've walked through it. Maybe even seen a historical marker on the field noting that it's a historic athletics ground. But back in 1892, that area wasn't very lush. It was pretty much just a brown dirt, rocks, an old field that the school used for pretty much any kind of outdoor or athletic activities that they had. The students would congregate after that. Of course, the university was fairly small back then. We're talking 400, maybe 500 students total. And I think there are classes that are probably bigger than that now.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And it was all male back then, of course. And after class in the afternoon or on the weekends, the students would congregate on that old field to, throw balls around, play baseball, play, run, track, whatever they wanted to do. There was a small cadet corps on campus, as most universities back then had little cadet corps, and they would parade there and do their marching there. So it was just kind of an all-purpose field. And we had actually had some football games on campus before 1892. They were not intracollegiate games. We were not playing other universities. There was basically just groups of guys getting involved in intramural sports, and they'd hang out and play a game of football and do what 18-year-old guys do. They run and tackle each other probably a little too hard and have a good time after class. But so Charles Hargrett was a chemistry professor, and he had gone to school at Johns Hopkins up in Baltimore and evidently seen the game of football being played at Johns Hopkins. So he became interested in it. He bought a rule book, and he came back down here to Georgia, and he was a Georgia alum, and he organized a team, an actual proper team of guys who wanted to play football. And he taught them the rules out of the rule book. They had a football already. Of course, footballs back then were not the sleek footballs we have now, but they were big round balls, kind of more like a beach ball or a basketball. And he organized a game. He organized two games. One was against Mercer and one was against Auburn. The Mercer game was here in Athens, January 30th, 1892. Kind of a weird time now to think about having a football game, but that's when they could get it together. And of course, there was nothing like an established tradition of when you would have a football season back then. So they just did it when they needed to. And we beat Mercer 50-0 on a Saturday afternoon in Athens. Now, there is a great story, and I've never been able to confirm it. I've heard about it from a couple of sources. I'd like to think it's true. The gentleman who was scoring the game left at some point during the game to walk downtown to the city's official alcohol dispensary where you could legally buy alcohol. And that closed at dusk. So he wanted to get there and get his bottle of whiskey for the weekend before it closed. And he apparently missed a touchdown. So the score might have actually been worse, but the guy who was in charge of actually scoring the game was out, basically tailgating or getting ready for a tailgate.
That's where tailgating began. There you go.
It's the most Georgia football story possible, honestly. And really that's where it all began. I mean, very modest. There weren't 95,000 people on hand. There were maybe a couple hundred very curious spectators who'd heard about this game and wanted to see it played. And that was the beginning, just a very, very humble beginning.
Isn't that something? And of course, to where we are now with, back-to-back national championships.
Oh, yeah.
The University of Georgia football team. Now, you are an athletic history specialist, for the library there at the University of Georgia. Mm-hmm. So kind of go through, is there a special section where the athletic, history items can be found and books and that kind of thing? Is there a special section in the library where that's found?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for the one of these archival libraries at the university, and there are three of us, three of the libraries, archival libraries. And I work for the Hargrett Rare Book and Manuscript Library, which is the biggest of the three, and we encompass a lot of different things, but we also have the University Archives and the Athletics Association Archives. So we are in the Russell Special Collections building, which is a relatively new building, a campus. We've been here for about 10 years now. And if anyone is familiar with the new Terry College campus, we share that quad with Terry College. So we're behind Morris Hall and the Baptist Center and across from the Terry College and across from the North Campus parking deck. So we are open to the public. Anybody who wants to see anything at all relating to UGA sports history can come in here. No one, if you want to see the archives, you don't have to be a member of the UGA community. You don't have to be an academic. You don't have to have any ties to UGA. You can really just be someone who is interested in seeing this and come up. We'll find things for you. The Athletic Association Archive is massive. One of the ways that we kind of calculate the size of a collection is by shelf space. We call it linear feet. How much shelf space it takes up. And the Athletic Association Archives takes up just over 300 linear feet of shelf space. So appropriately just over a football field in length. Yeah. Oh, wow. If you put it all together. So there's plenty of stuff for anyone to see. And again, it's totally open to the public. We're happy to have people come in and see it.
Talk about some of the interesting items, interesting to you. That's interesting to you, that if someone comes to your section at the Hargrett Rare Book and Manuscript Library will find. Tell us some of the cool things that are cool to you.
Oh, sure. Wow. And this could honestly take hours. Yeah. There's so much in this collection and so much that's really fascinating. I'll tell you a couple of relatively recent things that we've gotten in. And relatively recent being the past few years. I think, of course, every Georgia fan knows the great win at the Rose Bowl over Oklahoma. We have the gloves that Sony Michel was wearing when he scored the winning touchdown in the Rose Bowl and the football that he carried into the end zone. So we have Stetson Bennett's armband, his play call wristband from his first national championship game. We have the wristbands that Keeley was wearing when he scored the pick six against Alabama. We have A.D. Mitchell's towel. And those are just some more relatively recent things, but actually just came into possession of 3 new photos of the 1897 team. And of course, the 1897 team was marred by tragedy. Richard Van Albade, Von Gammon was a football player on that team, and he was tragically killed in a game against Virginia in 1897. And so having 3 new photos of that team, including one which shows Von Gammon very clearly, is very exciting for me as a historian to have that. But beyond that, uniforms, Frank Sinkwich's jersey from 1941.
Wow.
We have a jersey signed by every member of the team that played in our first ever Orange Bowl against TCU. Appropriately enough, since we just beat them.
Yeah.
So these are things that just jump out to me that I find particularly interesting.
Are you always on the hunt for items? As much as you have stored and you have acquired, I'm sure there's always something else. Is there like a holy grail of Georgia football that you haven't? It's out there, but you haven't gotten it yet. Is there something you're searching for?
Oh, goodness. That's always a good question, because there's always something else out there. And we rely so much on people bringing in donations and bringing in things that they found in their closets or their grandparents or great grandparents left them. And so that's kind of how we attain materials. But for the holy grail of Georgia football, I just talked about the 1897 team.
Yeah.
So that season ended early because of the death of Von Gammon. And the Georgia State Legislature actually voted to ban football in the state of Georgia after that tragedy. So the Governor Atkinson was set to sign the bill that would ban football. And think of Georgia, how different it would be now.
Oh, wow. Yes.
Football was a misdemeanor. But Von Gammon's mother actually wrote a letter to the governor to say that she didn't think that the game should be banned. It was something that Von Gammon loved. It was a tragic accident, but she hoped that other young men would have the chance to play it. And that letter is, I think, the holy grail of Georgia football. We don't really know where it ended up, but there are always rumors that it's out there, but I've never seen it. I've never seen any real evidence that exists, but hopefully one day it'll turn up for us.
Well, if anybody in our audience knows where that letter might be, we'll get them in contact with you. Of course, we talk a lot about football, and the success that the University of Georgia has had in football obviously leads to that. But of course, Georgia's got all kinds of sports, 27, 28 team sports that have histories themselves. What about some of the interesting history items, maybe from basketball or track and field or golf? Georgia has a wide range of sports and has been successful in those sports. What about some of the interesting things that you have in your collection outside of football?
I'm glad you asked. People always ask about football, and I think rightly so. It's the sport that generates the most attention. But the archives is not just for football. It's for all the sports, and I want every sport to be represented. The one thing that really comes to mind immediately is, of course, Georgia's fantastic success in tennis,
right?
Both men's and women's tennis. When Coach Dan McGill, who was Georgia's legendary tennis coach for many years, from the 50s into the 80s, won 2 national championships and was the NCAA's all-time winningest coach in any sport when he retired and after the 88 season. We actually have his archives. His papers are about 30 boxes of Dan McGill's papers are here in the Special Collections Libraries. The family very generously donated them when he passed. And so it's such a wonderful look into how tennis at UGA was built, how it was administered, how the NCAA tournaments that were held here for so many years were administered. And of course, all the things that Coach Dan McGill did during his career, whether it be speaking, correspondence, that's all documented here. So it's a really wonderful look at the history of tennis at Georgia.
Of course, go ahead. Go ahead.
Please.
Yeah.
There are other things. We have baseball, basketball. We have track and field. Katura Orji, who is such a wonderful track and field athlete, she donated recently her 2016 Rio Olympics track and field uniform to us. And So these are a lot of the things that you'll find in the archive that you maybe wouldn't think about.
Yeah. I, of course, Georgia and Georgia Tech. All right. Just take that for example. The rivalry, the historic rivalry between Georgia and Georgia Tech in football, but in all sports as well. Do you have a special section?
Just in day-to-day life.
Yeah, just in day-to-day life. Do you have a special section of, teams we love to hate?
Yeah, I just carry those internally.
I got those.
I do often get asked, who is our biggest rival? My answer will be Auburn, but so that the great thing about the archives is that's just all throughout the collection. You just see that all throughout. I think it would be fun to kind of pull out everything, and that may be a good idea for a future museum exhibit. Just pull out things from our biggest rivals and items, photographs related to the big moments in those rivalries. That could be a lot of fun.
When you talk about history, but history is being made in the moment.
Okay.
So this run that the University of Georgia football team has had, this historic run, it's history. The back-to-back national championships. So as a historian yourself, when when you're in the moment of history, do you look at an item and say, man, I'd love to have that? You talked about Stetson Bennett's armband, with the plays on it and everything. As a historian, do you ever think, I need to go get that, to put it in the collection? Does that kind of run across in your mind when you're watching in real time history being made?
Yeah, absolutely it does. Whenever I'm watching a game, certainly in the playoff run that we've had the last couple of years, it's always in my mind as to what we're doing, the importance it has historically in terms of the context of the rest of the program, but also how to best document it. I always have what I call my 100-year rule, and certainly we collect things for today. We collect them because we want to keep them, but I always think in 100 years, what will we need to have collected to say that we have best documented the program as it is now? I don't want my my successor 100 years from now saying, gosh, what was Hasty doing back then? He wasn't collecting things. So I always have that in mind of not just today, but what will we need in the future to best document our era. And certainly I look back and we have eras that are much better documented than others. The 40s are wonderfully documented.
Yeah.
The 80s are wonderfully documented. We have some great times in the 60s, and that's just football. And there's certainly in other sports as well. There are eras that are really well documented, some not so much. So it's always a struggle for me to say, what can we do and how can we best document Sarah? How can we best show what our student athletes and our coaches are doing right now, and how can we preserve that for the future?
And of course, the cool thing, from 1890s, you didn't have media, the visual media. You couldn't document things in that way, but now you can. Obviously, that I would assume that would make things easier, to show in real time from the media standpoint. We talk a lot about the football team, basketball team. What about women's sports at UGA? A fantastic history in women's basketball, tennis as well, and golf. What about, talk a little bit about how we document the contribution of women's sports to the life of the University of Georgia?
Sure, and that's a point of emphasis for me. When we took in the Athletic Association archives, when this building opened, women's sports had not really been well documented. And that's something that I have been working to correct, because it is a huge part of the story of athletics at Georgia. And you think of women's athletics, you think of the success of the women's tennis teams, the perfect 10 national championships of the gymnastics team, the swim and dive teams. So that is something that that is a kind of a hole in the archives that I'm working to fill. And unfortunately, with archives, things don't always move quickly. So it is an ongoing process, and I'm hoping as we go along to add more and more women's items. I've been able over the years to add quite a bit, but there's always more to be added. And one of the ways we go about doing this is talking to people. You know, whenever I'm at a public event or talking to someone, say, hey, you know, this is something that we're trying to do. This is an area that I'd like to have better documented in the collection, to better represent, again, what our student athletes, what our coaches are doing. And women's sports is certainly a huge area of emphasis. The other thing that I do every year, I do a different type of a museum exhibit that explores a different topic in Georgia sports history. Of course, 1972 saw the passage of Title IX, which really opened up collegiate athletics to women. And so for last fall's exhibit, I did a large-scale exhibit about the history and development of women's sports on campus, dating back to the PE and intramural years, the 1920s, really continuing to today. And so that's another way of just publicizing, we have this rich history. You know, here are some things that we have, but in talking to people about what we have on display, it's always a good opportunity to say, hey, we need more, we need to document this better. And let's, if there are things out there, please, you know, consider donating them to the library and to the archives.
Of course, February is, Black History Month. And, the history of the African-American athlete at the University of Georgia, for a longer time, you had segregation and,
Sure.
and the opportunity for African-Americans was limited as far as being involved at the University of Georgia in athletics. What about that aspect? Do you do something special during something like Black History Month to highlight the contribution of African-American, athletes to the University of Georgia, which is, you can't measure it?
No, you can't. And certainly not only athletes, but all the people who worked behind the scenes, certainly in the era of segregation, people like Clegg Starks or Squab Jones, men who worked for the athletic department for almost essentially their whole lives, or were associated with the athletic department for almost their whole lives. But of course, never had the opportunity to get on the field in any capacity beyond working. And certainly that's something that we have to remember and we have to acknowledge. Or just the building of Sanford Stadium. Many people don't realize that, as with most large-scale construction projects in the state of Georgia before World War II, convict labor, which was mostly Black labor, was used in the construction process to do the manual labor, the digging, the pouring, the foundations. Most of that work was done by convicts, and Sanford Stadium was one of those construction projects. So when we look back at the history of building Sanford Stadium, which is of course coming up on its 100th anniversary, we have to remember that the labor was done by men who were not really necessarily given an option about whether they wanted to or not. They weren't necessarily paid, and that they were almost exclusively Black laborers. And certainly they did not have the opportunity to play for Georgia or to even see a game at Sanford.
Yeah.
So we have to certainly remember that as well. But getting back to your question, that is a lot. It is a long history that we have to be cognizant of, we have to be aware of. I spoke a moment ago about the museum exhibits that I do every fall. Last year, of course, excuse me, I'm still in 2022 in my mind.
Yeah.
Back in 2021, of course, that was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the first 5 Black athletes to the football team. And so I wanted to commemorate that by doing an exhibit exploring the history of the history of not only that event, but the integration of our team going back to pre-World War II all the way up to today, because there are certainly events that are happening today that impact Black people getting more experience, getting more opportunity, I should rather say, in athletics here. So that exhibit was up, and there's a digital exhibit called oh goodness, my brain just went blank. There's a digital exhibit that's up that people can explore that history. can explore the experience of these people in that's certainly something that we will be promoting as well. So it's such a large topic, and I try to make it something that permeates everything that we do. We acknowledge that segregation happened. We acknowledge that people had limited opportunity, had no opportunities because of their skin color, and try to really just keep that at the forefront of what we're doing. Make sure that people acknowledge and remember these things. I don't think I would be doing a good job as a historian if I buried that.
Well, history has its good and its bad, and it is you can't change it or color it, and you just have to present it, and I think that's good for all of us to do. I'm of the age I think back sometimes the earliest football coach, and as a kid, when I was a kid, the earliest football coach I can remember, and I know I'm dating myself here, is Wally Butts. I mean, Wally Butts. Of course, I was young at the tail end of his career. And I think, one of the interesting things about Wally Butts is that he had a clash with Saturday Evening Post.
Oh, goodness.
Kind of an interesting item in history. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So the Saturday Evening Post scandal. With that, you really have to go back a little ways into the end of Wally Butts' tenure at Georgia. I think we all know that the 1950s were not the best decade for Georgia football.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of reasons, some relating to Wally Butts, some relating to the university, that were just totally out of Coach Butts' control. So it was a difficult period all around, and it was a difficult period for the university itself. And that kind of flowed over into athletics. So Coach Butts won one last SEC championship in '59, and then coached. Of course, Grant Tarkenton was quarterback for that. Then he coached in 1960, but fan support and alumni support had really started to move against Coach Butts, and there was an idea that he had coached too long, and it may be time for him to move on. So he retired as football coach, but remained athletic director. And that wasn't necessarily a satisfactory arrangement. Johnny Griffith was hired as our head football coach. It's debatable as to how much influence Coach Butts had in hiring him. Some indications are that that decision wasn't entirely in his hands, even though he was athletic director. And it was an awkward arrangement. He was overseeing the football program, even though he had been kind of removed from the football program. So just, again, not the best arrangement.
Yeah.
And like most coaches in that day, because salaries for coaches back then were not what they are now, he had to have business interests outside of his coaching career. And Wally Butts had not always been super successful in some of his interests. But he'd found a place at an insurance agency in Atlanta. And this seems like a strange divergence, but it comes into play later on. So Coach Butts, one of his good friends, was a man named Paul Bear Bryant. Yeah. Any fan of Southern football knows who Bear Bryant is. And if you don't, I could recommend a couple of good books to you. So they were good friends. They had a long-standing relationship dating back to the 1940s. So 1960, or end of 1962, I apologize if my date on that is wrong. A gentleman was calling the insurance agency that Wally Butts was associated with. And somehow, some way, he claimed that the wires on the phone call got crossed, and he ended up hearing a conversation between Wally Butts and Bear Bryant. This gentleman said that he didn't know much about football, but he recognized the names, and he decided to continue to listen in on the phone call and make notes about it, which seems strange to me. I would probably just hang up and say that was odd, but I'm not going to listen on a private phone call. later on, he alleged that the conversation that he heard between Butts and Bryant was one where Butts and Bryant it was 1962, were conspiring to fix the 1962 Georgia-Alabama game. Now, as a lifelong Georgia fan, it pains me to say this, there was no reason to fix the 1962 Georgia game. That was one of the worst ever teams we ever had. You hate to say that. And Alabama had some guy named Joe Namath at quarterback. They were pretty good that year.
Yeah.
So he alleged that they were conspiring to fix this game. Butts was giving Bryant inside information on our players and our some things for his defensive players to watch for, things we were tipping off. And so eventually these notes got to the Saturday Evening Post, which had been a very major publication in the 30s and 40s and 50s, but had really declined. And they were kind of at that point where they were starting to look to get into scandalous reporting to generate sales. To these days, we would say they were trying to get clicks on their website or wherever, but back then they were hoping to sell magazines by reporting on scandal. And they put out an article about this conversation, alleging that Butts and Bryant were fixing the game. And it was very difficult for Georgia, as you might imagine. And it was very difficult for Bear Bryant. Bear Bryant, I will say, had run-ins with the Post previously. They had run an article alleging that he coached a very brutal form of football. And he had actually taken them to court for libel. So Butts and Bryant sued the Saturday Evening Post for libel. And libel laws, I'm not a lawyer, I will only give my general understanding of this. Libel laws were in this country at that point were such that they really only covered public figures, but they defined public figures essentially as politicians.
Yeah.
So private individuals were really not covered by libel laws, or it didn't apply to them. Again, that may be a terrible interpretation, but I'm not a lawyer. So Butts and Bryant sued and won. They won a large settlement. Bryant actually settled out of court, but the onus of the article really fell on Wally Butts. They portrayed him as kind of a failed businessman and a sad figure. So he was suing as much to save his reputation as much as to get any kind of money or to take this article out. But he eventually won. Now, the case did go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ended up siding with Butts. And it changed libel law in this country to really apply to not just politicians, but anyone in the public sphere who's been slandered in print or wherever. So it ended up being kind of a landmark case legally, but it was a very difficult time for Georgia. Anytime, of course, you have a gambling accusation going against your university and going against a man who had previously been a very well-respected coach, it harms you. One of the aside from the legal ramifications of this, one of the things that it did was to cause Butts eventually resigned as athletic director. He realized that he was just causing too much distraction. I think the university was kind of glad at that point that he could leave and distance themselves from him. But it caused Dr. O.C. Adderhold, who was president of the university, to hire someone from the outside to come in and really clean up the athletic department and get it going forward again, where it had not been in such great shape in the 50s. So he hired Joel Eves. Joel Eves brought in Vince Dooley.
Yeah.
So we are living in the aftermath of the Butts Bryant Saturday Evening Post scandal.
Yeah.
In that way.
It should be a movie. It should be a movie. And the Stetson Bennett story, it's got to be a movie, and well, listen, it's been great to have Jason Hasty with us. He's the athletics historian and archivist at the University of Georgia. Jason, it's a pleasure having you on our program. I could listen to your stories all day long. I just love history myself. And when it's related to our beloved University of Georgia, it's so fascinating to hear that. And once again, give us your location and where people can actually go and visit you and visit your section of the library.
Sure. No, we're in the Russell Special Collections Libraries. It's on Hull Street on campus. Like I said, it's right across from the new Terry College campus, right behind the old Holiday Inn, right on Hull Street. So we're open 8 to 5 Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and 8 to 7 Tuesday, Thursdays. So we don't have any weekend hours, but certainly anybody who is here in Athens during the week can come and visit us. And I will say, though, that you don't have to be just in Athens to visit, because every summer I do a tour of public libraries around the state. I take 45, 50 artifacts from the Athletic Association archives to 7 or 8 different public libraries for a day. People can come in. It's totally free. They want to listen to my stories, I'll talk their ear off. They want to see some cool stuff, they can do that. This summer we'll be going to Tucker, Eatonton, Canton, Young Harris. We'll be going to Bainbridge and Valdosta. And so we've got one more set up as well, but that has not gotten on the books yet. But we'll be all around the state, so keep an eye out for that as well.
Indeed, we'll be looking for that. Well, thank you, Jason, for being with us today on our program. And hey, go Dawgs, right?
Go Dawgs, absolutely. And thank y'all for having me on. I do appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Dawgs on Demand would like to thank Southeast Mortgage, the official home loan lender of the Georgia Bulldogs, for sponsoring our program today. When the time comes to finance or refinance your home, make the smart choice and get your home loan from Southeast Mortgage. Your friends at Southeast Mortgage are ready to help you. Visit southeastmortgage.com/UGA today for more information. Be sure to visit Dawgs on Demand on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and our great interactive website, dogsondemand.com. Join us for our next program as we keep you up to date with the latest sports news from the University of Georgia and more. Until then, be safe and go Dawgs.